Okay, so content and textual analysis is a research method that you can do from anywhere at any time. So it's a fantastic method to employ during a global pandemic when you suddenly have your senior research project derailed. It's tied very much into what we do with the class. It is a means of studying culture. It's tied into cultural studies and critical theory and comes straight out of Marx's critical theory and cultural studies. It's linked to studying dominant ideologies and the way they contribute to hegemony. It's very much a political endeavor and acknowledges that the questions you ask are always inherently part of a larger political project that is in which it is impossible to be objective. Research is always a power struggle for critical theorists. Content and textual analysis is fundamentally about studying ideology or speaking truth to power. It's a great way to study mass culture as well. Generally, you're studying up on dominant ideologies or beliefs, and you're looking at how hegemony is operating in the larger culture. What are the larger beliefs that create a system of power, privilege, and domination? It's a method for systematically analyzing these things. So remember, you're not just looking at media. You've got to have a clear and systematic plan for what you're going to code, and nobody gets it right the first time. So think very carefully about what you want to study and how you want to study it. So remember, what you're trying to do with content and textual analysis is take a look at what the dominant culture or the larger culture is thinking. You're studying up using methods that allow you to look at culture. The content refers to things like words, meanings, pictures, symbols, ideas, anything being communicated directly. The textual piece of the analysis is more what's visual or spoken or underpins it as a means of communication. You can be looking at themes, issues, or recurring motifs. What type of analysis you want to do really depends on the question you're asking, the data you have, and what you're able to ascertain. Most people combine a variety of approaches using some content and some textual analysis in order to finish their research project. What you do is ultimately up to you. Classic examples include Darnell Hunt's study of the Los Angeles riots. He found that descriptors by race often didn't match images that were shown on the screen. Kane and Hasbrook studied men's and women's college basketball, and they found that attributions of success varied tremendously by gender. With men's basketball, the men shot and scored. In women's basketball, the ball was put up. Famous fitness models. Select a sample. I'm going to study the top 5 Insta-famous models of either gender. I'm going to take a look at 10% of their posts over the last year. Collect the data, review the data. Then you're going to have to design a coding scheme. What are you going to code for? Is it going to be the words, the images? How are you going to code the images? Once you've created a coding scheme, it's imperative that you actually go about testing it. Sorry, that's my kid. Welcome to my world. Once you've tested the coding scheme, you want to go back and refine it. I have never had a coding scheme work perfectly on the first try. There's always things you miss. There's always things that you've included that end up not being meaningful. Once you've gone ahead and coded for things, you're going to have to summarize the data, present it, and think about your findings. Classic content analysis would look at frequency. How often does something appear? Direction. Is the message positive, negative? The intensity. How strong is the message? And the space. How much space is something taking up? But now that we're analyzing social media, there's a lot of other things we need to look at too. In addition, when you're doing image analysis, you have to think about things like body positioning, what else is in the frame, and all the different messages being sent with the use of imagery. Remember, there's also things to think about with social media, like the frequencies of posts, the number of likes, the comments, the tone of the comments, what's mentioned, what's excluded. And visually, there's a lot more going on than you'd have to deal with say, a newspaper article. When you're coding, you're really coding in two different ways. What's traditionally called manifest coding is where you're looking very explicitly for something in the content. So you might be counting up how many times a certain word or phrase appears. You might be coding body position. It's something clear and unambiguous. Latent coding gets more at the tone or themes that are present there. This requires a high degree of cultural competency. People sometimes don't take this as seriously. However, it is a very important and valid type of coding. Once you've got your coding scheme, you're going to test it. By practicing, you're going to figure out what are you missing, what else needs to be in there. You ultimately know when you're done when you test it on content and you're not running into a lot of questions. If more than one person is coding content, you need to establish intercoder reliability. This means that you're both interpreting content in exactly the same way. Usually, you want to have over 90% consistency. Content and textual analysis makes a lot more sense when you have a bunch of examples. I'm going to give you a few examples here, including coverage of men's and women's sports, mainstream coverage of HIV positive athletes, reaction to Don Imus's statements about women basketball players, and men's and women's health and fitness magazines. This first study looks at men's versus women's sports and media coverage. Michael Messner, one of the primary authors, argues that in order to address inequity in gender or anything else, you need to address it at the individual level of day-to-day practices, in institutions, structured roles, and hierarchies, and in symbolic manifestations within the larger culture. Hence, they were interested in whether men's and women's sports got commensurate coverage. As always, they didn't just start out making things up. They took a look at what was already in the literature. What did we already know about men's versus women's sports coverage? They decided to code 6 weeks of television news for the 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. broadcasts on 3 local networks in the Los Angeles area. They also took a look at ESPN Sports Center for 3 weeks at the 11 p.m. broadcast and Fox Southern California Sports Report for 3 weeks worth of broadcasts. They used the same coding scheme for all of them. The manifest coding or content was primarily devoted to how much time was spent on each story, men's, women's, gender neutral. What was the lead story? What was being covered by the ticker? Were there any teasers for stories? The types of sports covered, and the race and gender of the commentators. For the tone, they looked for things like gag features or jokes, themes related to sexualization. In an early version of this study, a woman with ample cleavage was frequently featured as a running joke. Tone of coverage, and what was done to build audiences, to create the idea that the events were important, historic, or meaningful. In the latest iteration of the study, the authors were a little bit disappointed to discover that women still received quantitatively less and qualitatively worse coverage. Little had changed quantitatively in 10 years, and though there was improvement in naming, gender marking, and less overt sexualization, there were still sexist problems within sport media. The first research project I published was a content and textual analysis of the HIV positive announcements made by different athletes, most notably Magic Johnson, Tommy Morrison, and Greg Louganis. My impetus for the project was what I saw immediately as very different coverage for Greg Louganis and Magic Johnson depending on their sexuality. What their identities were really shaped how people saw them, and in particular, what I saw was a stigmatization of people who were seen as not straight and the privileging of male sexuality. For our study, our sample were 3 of the top newspapers in the United States at the time: the Washington Post, New York Times, and Los Angeles Times. We looked at all of the articles covering HIV announcements of Greg Louganis and Tommy Morrison, and all the articles on Magic Johnson for 3 months following his announcement, and 10% for the following year. Our initial coding scheme obviously had many more codes, but this is what the focus of our analysis became. The textual piece focused in on the tone that was used in the article when they discussed whether or not the person was a hero, victim, or carrier. We found that articles tended to express either shock and surprise, silence, conflations of sexuality, race, and class, or conflations of sexual identity and what one was doing. Ultimately, we found that there were many more articles about Magic Johnson because of the status of basketball in our larger culture. Moreover, there was a presumption that Greg Louganis, the self-identified gay man, was the risk to the heterosexual population, whereas Magic Johnson had been put at risk by his desirability from women. For Magic Johnson, the exact phrase used was that he accommodated as many women as possible. Interestingly, when they did decide to critique Magic Johnson for excessive sexuality, suddenly race entered the picture, whereas masculinity always was given a pass. The tendency to link excessive sexuality to non-white status has been historically incredibly problematic for communities. Here's one some of you may have read. After Don Imus referred to the Rutgers women's basketball team as quote unquote nappy headed hoes, my friends and I coded the response to that. For manifest coding, we looked at who is named versus simply referred to without giving them the courtesy of their name, racial markings, how people were identified by race, and who was interviewed. For latent coding, we looked at whether the comment was presented as racist, racial but not racist, or not problematic. In addition, we also looked at whether the comment was perceived as having sexism embedded in it as well. While results always make it seem as if analysis was easy and smooth, we actually had over 80 variables represented in our content scheme in addition to conducting textual analysis. Here are just some examples of the things that we included in our coding scheme. It's really important to remember that what's not there could be just as important as what is. The coach of the Rutgers team was rarely named, nor were the players, while the people who had committed offenses against them received a tremendous amount of name recognition. While black leaders were not named about half the time, women's leaders were not named about 95% of the time. As you can see with the last slide and this slide, really we were interested in who was given voice within the narrative, whose story was important, whose story wasn't being told, who was the event being framed as about, and one of our key findings was a real lack of understanding things from an intersectional perspective. The idea that the players were discussed the way they were because they were both women and people of color was not really in the narrative. One of our more shocking findings was actually a very simple one. It was that the total number of articles about the Don Imus incident actually exceeded the number of articles about the entire NCAA women's basketball tournament. That's quite telling. The next two slides highlight the way the articles framed the people involved, the members of the Rutgers women's basketball team and Don Imus himself. The women were often simply not discussed almost 2/3 of the time. By contrast, we see that there's a mixed framing when it comes to Don Imus, as the comment was seen as rather problematic. In some ways, I'm being a little bit sarcastic there, because one of our key findings was the way people were happy to call something racially tinged without discussing racism. Overall, as the next few slides show, what we saw was fundamentally a narrative that wasn't really about sexism or racism or their intersections. What we saw was more a narrative about a single bad actor who was being brought to justice. Once you've got your data, you then want to use the literature to help you interpret it. As I mentioned, we noticed this lack of intersectionality in the data we found. Patricia Hill Collins is quick to tell us how this in and of itself is problematic as one tries to fight oppression. Historically, linkages between race and gender have been a critical way that female athletes, especially female athletes of color, have been minimized. Moreover, the framing of the problem as a single individual's racism ultimately plays into what Bonilla Silva calls the minimalization of racism, or the idea that racism is no longer a problem that impacts people's life chances. Sometimes when I do content and textual analysis, I start to feel a bit repetitive because yet again it turned out that hegemonic masculinity or dominant masculinity was largely protected from scrutiny, while preconceived notions of race, class, and gender were underlying assumptions. So several of you mentioned an interest in studying how popular culture frames men's and women's bodies, and that certainly is something I've been interested in doing. I actually wrote a book about it. So the final example I have here for you is content and textual analysis of men's and women's health and fitness magazines. For the textual piece, we took a good look at what fundamental assumptions were about what makes up health and fitness, the overall tone, moral panic over bodies, and assumptions regarding sexuality. My co author and I wrote a book about it in the end. One of the things that really struck us was how much things changed during the 10 years we were conducting our research. One of the key ways that this happened was in the way that men's bodies were presented. One of the things we coded was the way that the cover model was presented. In the earlier men's magazines, men's were depicted as active about 20% of the time. What we mean by active is actively engaged in working out or participating in a sport. By contrast, about 60% of the time, they were shown action implied, meaning they were holding something that indicated a workout or type of workout about to start or just finishing. So, for example, they might be holding a basketball or a weight. As you can see, women were never active even in these early images, but at least almost 15% of the time they had some action implied through the use of props. But as we move towards the more current sample, what we start to find is that women are never shown in action or action implied, and men's magazines also start to move towards depicting men in inactive poses. There also starts to be more overlap in the way men's and women's bodies are posed, though some poses do remain explicitly gendered. For example, the hand on the hip thrust to one side, was an exclusively female pose. Another thing we were interested in was the way that race was used within the magazines and in advertisements. One thing we noticed was the failure to put non-white people into prominent positions, such as cover models. Take a look here at the race of the people depicted as cover models. Now, of course, it's a little more difficult to identify the race of a model. How did we do this? Well, sometimes we didn't know, and that's where you see the other category. In many cases, we simply looked up the person's biography, and they often said themselves what they self-identified as. Obviously, we wrote an entire book about our findings, so we had a lot to say, but just to sum it up briefly, Frege Haug had mentioned the subjective aspects of being as object, meaning that while women are often objectified in larger culture, there are aspects of objectification that are pleasurable and are subjective, so that when women are working on being desirable objects, that is a subjective experience for the women involved. That's complicated. You may have to think about it a little bit. Sherry and I also argued that there are objective aspects of being as subject. What we mean by this is even though male bodies were asked to perform subjectivity, they were asked to do so from a fairly objective point of view. They were asked to perform a very specific type of masculinity. Moreover, there was a conflation of health, fitness, and appearance, meaning that it was presumed that a body that looked a particular way was healthy. They also often recommended things that weren't even a little bit healthy under the guise of health. My favorite being mashing a ripe avocado in your hair. Well, I'm not saying shiny hair is a bad thing. I'm just thinking that it's not indicative of overall health. Finally, one of our other key findings was this idea of the body as a neoliberal individualized project. Your health and body become your own personal responsibility without the myriad of ways that our social world, policies, and politics play into what's going on with your bodies and your access to healthcare. So there it is. That's what content and textual analysis is. Here are some resources. They may be a little dated, but this was sort of an unexpected twist for all of us. Keep in mind the most critical thing you're going to be doing right now is designing a coding scheme. You can stick with any of your original projects. You just need a coding scheme that's going to look more at content or the way that something's being presented in dominant discussions or in the text. For those of you who want to switch over to looking at social media and the pandemic, start thinking about exactly how you want to study this. Thanks, everyone.